In the studio with us today, we have a special guest to talk about one of the recent activities that has been going on with the NT government, as well as a lot of Aboriginal and community sectors. And that is none other than the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, Selena Uibo. Thank you so much for joining us today, and it's good to see you again.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back in the studio and talking about the great things that we're doing as a Labor government.
That's right. We are in the studio today to talk about one of the big things that have actually gone on, that being the Aboriginal Justice Agreement, where a bunch of corporations and organisations and community groups have gone together to actually help discuss the future for... It's mostly about people offending the law and all that other stuff.
It's that in a nutshell, Calum. So the Aboriginal Justice Agreement is looking at those really high incarceration rates. So our mob who are locked up, who are in prison, but then return to prison as well, sometimes within, 6 months of being released, 8 months, within a year. So really looking at how we can target the behaviour that causes criminal activity, that causes our mob to get placed in the justice system, but also preventing any of the reoffending. Over 85% of Territorians who are in our prisons are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander Territorians. So that's very, very high numbers considering our mob make up a third of the Territory's population of being Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. So we're grossly overrepresented in the justice system, in our prisons here in the Territory, and unfortunately it's a similar story in other parts of Australia. But what we're looking at here in the NT is how we can really tackle some of the reasons why people commit crimes, why they end up in our jails and why they end up back in our jails. And that's what the Aboriginal Justice Agreement is focused on. And as you know and as you mentioned, it's not just a government initiative. We're looking at Aboriginal leaders from right across the Territory who've had input to make this agreement reflective of what our communities need, what they want, what they deserve to have, but also our Aboriginal organisations and how we can empower Aboriginal programs, Aboriginal leadership to be able to guide what needs to be done better by government, by non-government organisations about justice for our mob.
So the AGA has come about, and like you mentioned before, it is one of the first of its kind. But there were 3 key points, and let's just kind of go over them. Is that okay with yourself?
Of course.
So the first one, one of the big key points is reducing reoffending and imprisonment rates, as we were just discussing. How?
So looking at being creative and looking at what it is that our people need. So when we're talking about reducing rates, we're talking about people who are locked up, who may not have access to program, who may be on remand for long periods of time, are not able to access programs for behaviour that maybe has been able to contribute to why they have been locked up or found themselves in jail and away from family, away from country.
Has there been anything identified for the whole point of reoffending?
Some of those areas we're looking at are therapeutic programs, so programs that really target whatever that behaviour or those circumstances are that have caused that person to find themselves in jail and or to commit that criminal offence. But also, how can we ensure that when our mob are released, that they don't end up back in jail in those very short to medium term time frames? So what is it that people struggle with when they're outside of the prison that may cause temptation or may force that continuation of reoffending? So alternatives to custody is one key area, but also law and justice groups, that our mob have a say, that Aboriginal leadership guides that process of justice. Victims of offences, sometimes unfortunately with our mob it is family and friends and close relatives of the offender, so it's just this unfortunate cycle that continues. So our mob hurting our own mob, not just strangers in the street or people not related to, but how do we really stop that cycle that affects all of our community, that affects our children, that affects our elders, and law and justice groups is a really great way to step through that. There have been,
in the community of Umbakamba, where there have been groups of kids that are untethered, just going and attacking a lot of the teachers and a lot of the people, like with residents and stuff like that. And there's been a call for the Department of Education to actually do something about it. Not your department, but it is a good point of reference of like what do you do? And these are a lot of kids who've actually been reoffenders, and it's a very unfortunate thing to actually see, and there's not much that people can do.
Well, right now, I know you mentioned youth justice. 100% of youth detainees, so young people who are in detention centres, are Aboriginal young people. We have partnered that with Territory Families, our department, so separated it out as per the Royal Commission into detention of young people in the Territory, that it doesn't sit with adult justice. We don't want a pipeline where we create environments that if young people are in detention, that they're then got this pipeline into adult justice. So we need to really treat those root causes of crime. Bigger work that we're doing, which also feeds into the work around justice, remote and urban housing, overcrowding we know is a huge issue for our people, looking at more houses in our communities, more houses on our homelands, more houses in our urban centres to reduce that overcrowding and the pressures of overcrowding. Education, as you mentioned, and making sure that we've got really strong pathways, particularly our middle years and older students, that if school is not something that they're going to continue to complete at Year 12, what are our other options? Traineeships, apprenticeships, employment. So what are the other areas we can support our young Aboriginal youth to be able to look at, the future for themselves in their community, or to move to other places but have those employable skills? So bigger work, Territory Families, reducing the amount of out-of-home care that is required for Aboriginal children in care and protection. So we have now lessened the number of out-of-home care for Aboriginal young people, so kinship carers, more family members being able to provide that support, so our Aboriginal young people are not separated from family and culture and language. So it feeds into a really big space that we're working in, but if we're not doing all these things as a part of a bigger picture, it's not going to work as just a single government policy or a single initiative or just one government agency. As recognising Aboriginal leadership is critical to ensuring that we have the right programs, the right support, the right governance for delivery youth justice programs, for cultural rehabilitation programs, for parent and carers programs. We want to make sure that people, no matter where they live in the Territory, have the appropriate support for themselves, for their family, to be able to access appropriate support and not rely on someone coming in from an outsider community or a town and imposing those programs, which will not be successful that way.
Speaking of leadership, and there's actually another thing I wanted to talk about that you just mentioned, but one of the other main key points was Aboriginal leadership.
Yes.
What I wanted to ask was, how is that different from some of the other things that the government has set up in the past to involve Aboriginal leadership?
When we take the example of the work that has gone into the Aboriginal Justice Agreement, it's been 5 years in the making since we came to government as a Labor government, 2016. Unfortunately, with COVID, it delayed the progress of the Aboriginal Justice Agreement, particularly around consultations, but over 120 places across the Northern Territory were visited. Over 160 consultations were conducted by the Aboriginal Justice Unit, which sits in my department, Attorney General's department. And that was frank and fearless, honest, open conversation from Aboriginal leaders, Aboriginal community members, Aboriginal organisations about how do we ensure that Aboriginal voice is not just heard, but action also is followed through that leadership. Some places have some really strong Aboriginal leadership. There are other places in the Territory which need support and need that boosting and that support, that capacity building. So how can we ensure, whether our remote communities, our remote homelands, our town centres, our urban centres, rural areas, how can we ensure that the local Aboriginal leadership is strong to be able to guide, support, direct government and non-government organisations to meet and to support the needs of that Aboriginal community or that Aboriginal homeland or that region in the Northern Territory. So that's where it differs with the Aboriginal Justice Agreement. It's not just government, it's non-government, it's Aboriginal communities, Aboriginal leaders who are working in this space and working in a partnership.
And the final thing that we have on the three key aims is the improvement of justice responses and services for Aboriginal Australians. So that means, I'm assuming, just what they have access to in the communities?
It is that, but it's also what do people have and know about their rights as Territorians, their rights as Australians. One of the key...
Their legal rights?
It can include legal rights. One of the key areas that the consultation uncovered over the last 5 years is a lot of Aboriginal Territorians aren't aware of some of those protection mechanisms, like the Anti-Discrimination Commission, like some of the areas, the Children's Commissioner, where you can have complaint processes, where you can get extra support for what is happening in your community. If it's happening in a wrong way, how do you report that? Who's going to follow up? The Ombudsman, for example. A lot of people hadn't heard of some of these really important independent bodies that operate in the Northern Territory to protect the rights of Territorians, regardless of race. But how do we make sure that those processes, those government services, those independent officers are accessible and that people know about them? So that's an area where we can improve the process of government services and delivery of that information.
I know a few people asked me to ask about, but the funding.
Yes.
Okay, so there's $4.52 million. How will that be divvied out for this project?
So there is a 12-month implementation plan which will provide, it's deliberately left open to provide flexibility. Like I said, the things that work in one community may not work in another. So it's being able to look at the local context. If a law and justice group is being established, how can we support? Is it financial support? Is it more of the in-kind support, like providing Aboriginal interpreters, like providing government services to be able to establish space in it for a law and justice group to be able to meet, or the resources for a law and justice group to be able to deliver whatever it is that group is looking to achieve on that local context. So what we hope to achieve by having processes where we can see what's working, what's not working, is feeding into the long-term budget process of government, which is a normal cycle, an annual cycle, the long-term process. So the learnings we have over the next 6 to 8 months will feed into the budget process for the Northern Territory next year, and then looking at, obviously, Year 2 implementation, Year 3, Year 4, and so on.
Excellent. So the final thing I do have to ask is it's launching in Darwin, or it's launched?
Yes.
And it'll be launching in other places, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And that is Alice Springs in Kalkarindji. Do you have a time frame?
Yes. So we're looking to launch the Alice Springs Centralian Aboriginal Justice Agreement. Official launch will be the 24th of August, and Kalkarindji on Gurindji country. We know the Freedom Festival, and the long weekend, and the very significant place that holds in Australian history. The Gurindji Corporation and the TOs have given us permission to be able to do a remote Aboriginal justice launch on Gurindji country, and that'll be Friday the 27th of August. So it's pretty exciting, and we're very honoured.
Soon.
Yes, very soon. So by the end of the month, we will have covered north and south, and that special part on Gurindji country in Kalkarindji.
Excellent. Well, Minister, while we have you in the studio, is there anything else you'd like to mention to our listeners and watchers?
I would encourage anyone who is interested in justice, particularly our Aboriginal leaders and Aboriginal organisations right across the Northern Territory, to look at the Aboriginal Justice Agreement, to get support to go through the Aboriginal Justice Agreement and really see what it means for your community, your homeland, your town, your city in the Territory, and being able to look at new ways of supporting justice for our people, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters. And you can sign on and be a signatory to the Aboriginal Justice Agreement on the Attorney General's Department website. We can get that information to people through First Nations media. But really a lot of work needs to happen going forward. This is just a point in time, but we now have some more ways to measure success for our people, to see what we need to change, see that what we need to do better to support as government, but having non-government organisations, Aboriginal organisations, Aboriginal businesses, Aboriginal leaders part of the process. It's a walking together and not walking in front of.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming in today, and we're looking forward to seeing the results of what the Aboriginal Justice Agreement can actually provide. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Caleb. Thank you to your listeners and your watchers.